The stagecoach rattled into Paradise, Montana territory, on a blistering afternoon in July of 1876, carrying within its dusty interior a young woman whose heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird desperate for freedom. Georgia Haverford pressed her gloved hand against the worn leather seat, steadying herself as the wheels lurched over another rut in the hard-skaked earth, her other hand clutching a creased letter that had crossed an ocean and promised her a new life with a man whose face she had seen only in a single faded photograph. She had memorized every English word she could from the phrase book her mother had pressed into her hands at the Hamburg docks. But as she stepped down onto the wooden planks of Paradise's Main Street, the hot Montana wind stealing the breath from her lungs, she wondered if any amount of preparation could have readied her for this moment. The town sprawled before her in shades of brown and gray, false-fronted buildings lining a wide dirt road where horses stood tied to hitching posts, and men in wide-brimmed hats moved with purposes she could not fathom. The air smelled of dust and horses and something else, something wild that she had never encountered in the orderly streets of Hamburg. Her dark blue traveling dress, proper and fitted in the European style, felt absurdly heavy in the oppressive heat, and she could feel sweat beginning to trickle down her spine as she searched the sparse crowd for the face from the photograph. "Miss Haverford." The voice came from behind her, deep and uncertain, and she turned to find a man who bore only a passing resemblance to the stern-faced figure in the tintype. He was taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered beneath a dusty blue shirt, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of the summer sky. Benjamin Parker removed his hat as he approached, revealing sandy brown hair that stuck to his forehead with sweat, and offered what might have been intended as a reassuring smile, though it looked more like a grimace of nervousness. Yes," Georgia managed, the English word feeling thick and awkward in her mouth. She dipped her head in what she hoped passed for a graceful acknowledgement, her German instincts warring with her memorized English phrases. "I am Georgia, Benjamin Parker, but folks call me Ben." He held out his hand, then seemed to reconsider the gesture, letting it drop back to his side. "I hope your journey was not too difficult. It is a long way from Germany." She caught perhaps half the words, nodding as though she understood completely. "Long, ja, much long." The phrase book had not prepared her for actual conversation, for the way English words seemed to tumble over each other in a rush when spoken aloud. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled only by the sounds of the town around them. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A woman's laugh drifted from one of the buildings. Ben shifted his weight from one boot to the other, his hat turning slowly in his hands. "I have a wagon," he finally said, speaking slowly and gesturing toward a sturdy farm wagon hitched to two patient horses at the end of the street. "My ranch is about 5 miles outside of town. It is a good ranch. I think you will find it suitable." Georgia nodded again, though the word suitable meant nothing to her. She gathered her skirts with one hand, her small traveling case with the other, and allowed Ben to take the case from her grip. His fingers brushed hers accidentally, and both pulled back as though burned. The wagon ride out to the ranch passed in excruciating silence. Ben seemed to make several attempts at conversation, pointing out landmarks and explaining things in his slow, deliberate English, while Georgia smiled and nodded and felt panic rising in her chest with each passing mile. She had known the language barrier would be difficult, but she had not anticipated this complete inability to communicate. This sensation of being utterly adrift in a foreign world, where even the landscape looked alien and vast. The ranch house, when it finally came into view, was smaller than she had imagined. A low wooden structure with a covered porch and a roof of wooden shingles that looked in need of repair. Beyond it stretched corrals and outbuildings, and in the distance, she could see cattle moving like dark shadows across the golden grassland. Everything seemed impossibly open here, the sky stretching endlessly overhead without the familiar comfort of city buildings to contain it. Ben helped her down from the wagon with careful hands that barely touched her waist, and she found herself standing in the dusty yard, her traveling case at her feet, staring at what was meant to become her home. A black and white dog emerged from beneath the porch, tail wagging cautiously as it approached to sniff at her skirts. "That is Pepper," Ben said, his voice softening as he looked at the dog. "She is friendly. She will not harm you." Georgia knelt slowly, extending her hand for the dog to investigate. "Pepper," she repeated, and the word felt good in her mouth, simple and clear. The dog licked her fingers, and for the first time since arriving in Montana, Georgia felt something ease slightly in her chest. Ben showed her through the house, a tour that took only minutes given the modest size of the dwelling. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, and 2 bedrooms. He gestured to the larger of the bedrooms, which contained a brass bed covered in a faded quilt and a simple wooden dresser. "This will be yours," he said, then added quickly, "until. I mean, it is yours for now. I will sleep in the other room. I want you to feel comfortable here." The relief that flooded through Georgia must have shown on her face because Ben's shoulders relaxed slightly. She had wondered, during the long journey across the Atlantic, and then the seemingly endless train ride west, what would be expected of her upon arrival. Some of the other women traveling west had spoken in whispers of husbands who demanded their marital rights immediately, but Ben's careful propriety suggested he was not that sort of man. "Thank you," she said, and this time the English came more easily. "You are kind." Something flickered across Ben's face, an expression she could not quite read. He nodded, backing toward the door. "I will let you rest and unpack. There is water in the pitcher. Supper will be ready in about an hour if you are hungry." After he left, Georgia sank onto the edge of the bed, her traveling case unopened beside her, and allowed herself a moment of complete overwhelm. She had left everything familiar behind, everything she had ever known, to come to this strange place and marry a man who was essentially a stranger. The arrangement had been made through letters exchanged between Ben and her uncle, who had immigrated to New York 5 years prior. Ben needed a wife to help run his ranch. Georgia needed to escape a future that held only factory work and poverty in an increasingly crowded Hamburg. It had seemed logical, even providential, when discussed in the abstract safety of her family's cramped apartment. Now, surrounded by alien sounds and unable to communicate beyond the most basic phrases, Georgia wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. That evening they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, a meal of beef stew and biscuits between them. Ben had clearly tried to make the food presentable, and Georgia found herself touched by the effort even as she struggled to swallow past the tightness in her throat. "The town has a church," Ben ventured between bites. "The Reverend can marry us whenever you are ready. There is no rush. I want you to feel certain about this arrangement." Georgia caught the words church and marry and nodded, though she was not entirely certain what he was proposing. The silence stretched again, heavy and uncomfortable, until Ben suddenly stood and retrieved something from a shelf near the fireplace. He returned with a worn book, placing it on the table between them. It was a German-English dictionary, the cover creased and stained with use. Georgia's eyes widened, her fingers reaching out to touch the familiar Gothic script on the cover. "You have. This? I bought it in town before you arrived." Ben's ears had gone slightly red. "I thought it might help. I do not know any German, but maybe we could use this to understand each other better." Tears pricked at Georgia's eyes, surprising her with their sudden appearance. This cowboy, this stranger who had sent for a wife from across the ocean, had thought to buy a dictionary. It was such a small gesture, and yet it felt like an enormous kindness in this moment. "Thank you," she whispered, in German first and then in English. "Thank you very much." They spent the next hour bent over the dictionary, Ben attempting to explain various objects around the house, while Georgia searched for words to respond. It was clumsy and frustrating, but it was communication, and by the time Georgia finally retired to her room, exhausted beyond measure, she felt the first small spark of hope that perhaps this arrangement might work after all. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Ben rose before dawn to tend to the cattle and horses, leaving Georgia to navigate the house and attempt to understand her new responsibilities. She discovered quickly that running a ranch household was vastly different from keeping a small apartment in Hamburg. There was bread to bake, meals to prepare for a man who worked physically demanding labor all day, laundry to manage without the convenience of a washwoman down the street, and a garden that desperately needed attention. Georgia threw herself into the work with determination, even when she made mistakes. Her first attempt at bread resulted in dense, heavy loaves that could have served as doorstops. Ben ate them without complaint, slathering them with butter and telling her they were very good in a tone that suggested he was either being extraordinarily kind or had no taste whatsoever. Every evening, they sat together at the kitchen table with the dictionary between them. Ben would describe his day, speaking slowly and pointing to words in the book when Georgia looked confused. She, in turn, would tell him about Hamburg, about her family, about the life she had left behind. The conversations were halting and often comically misunderstood, but they were conversations nonetheless. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Ben came in from the range with a book tucked under his arm along with his usual saddle bag. It was a primer, the sort used to teach children to read. "I was thinking," he said, setting it on the table beside their dictionary, "that maybe I could learn some German while you work on your English. It does not seem right that you should do all the work of learning." Georgia stared at him, then at the primer, then back at him. "You want learn German if you will teach me." He looked almost embarrassed. "I know I am not good at languages. I barely made it through my schooling as it was, but it seems only fair." Something shifted in Georgia's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. She reached for the primer, flipping it open to the first page. "I teach you," she said firmly, "and you teach me. Together, yes." "Yes," Ben agreed, and his smile this time was genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. Together. The lessons became the foundation of their evenings. After supper, they would clear the dishes and spread their books across the table. Ben proved to be right about his difficulties with languages. German pronunciation seemed to tie his tongue in knots, and the grammatical cases made him throw up his hands in frustrated confusion more than once. But he persevered, scribbling notes in a small notebook and practicing words while he worked during the day. Georgia's English improved more rapidly, partly because she was immersed in it constantly, and partly because Ben turned out to be a patient and thoughtful teacher. He would bring things to the table to discuss: a horseshoe, a bit of rope, a wildflower from the range, and they would learn the words together, both in English and in German. "Ferd," Georgia would say, pointing to one of the horses visible through the window. "Horse," Ben would respond, then carefully attempt P Ferd, close, but the P and F together like this. She would demonstrate, sometimes having to repeat the sound multiple times before Ben could approximate it. When Ben successfully pronounced a difficult German word, Georgia would clap her hands in delight, and when she managed a particularly tricky English phrase, Ben would grin with such pride that she could not help but smile in return. As July melted into August, the language lessons expanded beyond the kitchen table. Ben began taking Georgia with him on some of his shorter rides around the ranch, pointing out landmarks and explaining the work of running cattle. She would sit beside him on horseback, learning terms like pasture and fence line and water hole, while teaching him wide and zonlini and wasserloch in return. One afternoon, as they sat their horses on a small rise overlooking a valley where his cattle grazed, Ben turned to her with an expression of carefully contained hope. "You think," he began, then paused, searching for the right words. "Do you think you could be happy here? In Montana, I mean." "On this ranch?" Georgia considered the question, gazing out over the vast landscape that had seemed so frightening when she first arrived. The endless sky no longer felt oppressive but liberating. The wildness that had unsettled her now seemed beautiful in its untamed state. "I think," she said slowly, choosing each English word with care, "I think yes. It is very different from Hamburg, but different is not bad, and you—" She hesitated, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "You are good man, Ben, kind man." Ben's face flushed beneath his tan. "You are a good woman, Georgia, better than I deserve, probably. I know this arrangement is not what most women would choose. I know I am just a simple rancher, and you gave up a lot to come here." "Simple is good sometimes," Georgia replied. "Complicated life in Hamburg was not happy life. Here is simple, but also is." She searched for the word, finally finding it in her expanding vocabulary. "Peaceful. Here is peaceful." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the horses shifting beneath them, before Ben spoke again. "Would you feel ready to marry soon?" "I do not mean to pressure you, but folks in town are starting to talk. It is not proper you staying at my house without us being wed. I want to protect your reputation." Georgia understood enough to nod. "Yes, I am ready. We marry soon." The wedding was arranged for the following Sunday. A simple ceremony in Paradise's small church with a handful of townspeople as witnesses. Georgia wore a dress she had brought from Germany, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, and Ben wore his best shirt and a string tie that he kept adjusting nervously throughout the ceremony. Reverend Matthews performed the service in English, speaking slowly enough that Georgia could follow the general meaning. When he reached the vows, Ben turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I promise to take care of you," Ben said, speaking directly to her rather than repeating after the reverend. "I promise to be patient and kind. I promise to keep learning your language and teaching you mine. I promise to make you happy if you will let me." They were not the traditional vows, but they were the ones that mattered. Georgia squeezed his hands, tears blurring her vision as she responded with her own promise. "I promise to be good wife. I promise to work hard and learn. I promise to make home for us. I promise to—" She struggled for the right words, finally switching to German for a moment before finding the English translation. "I promise to try to love you as you deserve to be loved." Ben's eyes widened slightly at that, something like wonder crossing his face, and then Reverend Matthews was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Ben was leaning down to press the gentlest, most careful kiss to her lips. The gathered townspeople applauded, and they were swept into a small reception at the church hall where the ladies of Paradise had prepared cake and punch. Georgia found herself surrounded by curious women asking questions she could only partly answer, their rapid English overwhelming her still developing skills. Ben stayed close, translating when he could, rescuing her when the attention became too much. As the sun began to set, they climbed back into Ben's wagon for the ride back to the ranch. The afternoon had been exhausting, but in a pleasant way, and Georgia found herself leaning slightly against Ben's shoulder as they rolled over the familiar road. "Are you happy?" Ben asked quietly, not looking at her but keeping his eyes on the horses. "Yes," Georgia answered and realized it was true. "I am happy." That night, in the bedroom they now shared, Ben continued his pattern of gentle consideration. He gave her time to change in privacy, waited until she was settled in bed before joining her, and made no demands beyond a good-night kiss that was sweet and brief. "I know this is all very new," he said softly into the darkness. "We can take things slowly. There is no rush." Georgia reached for his hand under the quilt, lacing her fingers through his. "You are very patient man, Ben Parker. You are worth being patient for, Georgia Parker." Hearing her new name spoken aloud gave her a strange thrill. She was Georgia Parker now, wife of a Montana rancher, resident of Paradise. It felt both foreign and right all at once. As August progressed into September, their life together found its rhythm. Georgia's English improved daily, though she still thought in German and occasionally mixed up words in ways that made Ben laugh. His German progressed more slowly, but he could now have basic conversations and understood much more than he could speak. More importantly, they began to understand each other beyond mere words. Georgia learned that Ben was quiet by nature, more comfortable with actions than declarations. He showed his care through small gestures, fixing the wobbly table leg that had frustrated her, bringing her wildflowers from the range, making sure the firewood was always stocked so she would not have to carry heavy loads. Ben learned that Georgia was stronger than she looked, both physically and emotionally. She never complained about the hard work of ranch life, threw herself into learning new skills with determination, and had a quiet sense of humor that emerged once she felt comfortable enough to show it. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Georgia ventured into new conversational territory. "Tell me about your family," she said, her English now fluid enough for such questions. "You never speak of them." Ben was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped between his knees. "There is not much to tell. My parents came out here when Montana was still considered wilderness. They homesteaded this land, built this ranch. My father died when I was 15. Snake bite. My mother passed 3 years later. Influenza. I have been on my own since then. No brothers, no sisters. I had a younger sister, Sarah." Ben's voice went soft. "She died when she was just 8 years old. Fever took her. It was a hard winter that year." Georgia reached over and took his hand, understanding the weight of those simple statements. "I am sorry, Ben. That is very sad. It was a long time ago," but his hand tightened around hers. "What about your family? Do you miss them terribly?" "Yes and no." Georgia struggled to explain. "I love my mother, my brothers and sisters, but there were so many of us and never enough food, never enough money. My father died in factory accident when I was 16. After that was very hard. My mother wanted better life for me than factory work and struggling. When Uncle Joseph wrote about opportunity in America, Mama encouraged me to take it. Do you regret it?" Ben turned to look at her, his expression serious. Leaving everything behind, Georgia considered the question carefully. "Sometimes I miss them, but I do not regret coming here. This is good life, Ben. Hard but good, and you?" She felt brave suddenly, perhaps emboldened by the soft light and the privacy of the porch. "You are more than I hoped for," Ben's breath caught audibly. "Georgia, He seemed to struggle with words, then simply pulled her closer, tucking her against his side. They sat that way until the stars began to appear, neither needing to speak. That night, their relationship shifted into something deeper. When Ben kissed her, It was with more passion than he had previously allowed himself, and when Georgia responded with equal fervor, the last barriers of awkward politeness finally fell away. They came together as true husband and wife, not just partners in a practical arrangement. And afterward, lying in Ben's arms, Georgia felt truly at home for the first time since leaving Germany. "I love you," Ben whispered against her hair, the words coming out in a rush as though he had been holding them back for weeks. "I think I have been falling in love with you since the first evening we sat together with that dictionary." Georgia pulled back enough to see his face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I love you too," she said in English, then repeated it in German. "Ich liebe dich." She wanted him to understand in both languages, to know that her feelings transcended the words used to express them. October brought the first hints of the coming winter. The aspen trees in the distant mountains turned gold, and frost began to appear on the ground in the mornings. Ben worked long days preparing the ranch for the harsh Montana winter, and Georgia worked alongside him when she could, learning to help with tasks that would have seemed impossible just months before. She learned to milk the cow, gather eggs from the henhouse, and churn butter. She learned which herbs would grow in Montana's short summer and how to preserve food for the winter months. Ben taught her to shoot, patiently instructing her on the rifle until she could hit a target with reasonable accuracy. "This is important," he explained seriously. "Sometimes I have to be far from the house. You need to be able to protect yourself if necessary. There are still wolves in the mountains, and occasionally bears come down looking for food." Georgia had felt a chill at the reminder of how wild this place still was, but she practiced diligently until Ben was satisfied with her skill. Their evenings remained devoted to learning, though now the lessons often dissolved into other activities as their attraction and love for each other grew. Sometimes they would start out studying vocabulary and end up simply talking, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for their future, observations about their day. Ben told her about his plans for the ranch, how he wanted to expand his herd, maybe build a bigger barn, eventually add rooms to the house if they needed the space. Georgia listened and offered her own ideas, surprising him sometimes with suggestions he had not considered. "You have a good head for this," he told her one evening after she proposed a better way to organize the tack room. "I never thought about arranging things that way, but you are right. It would be much more efficient." "In Germany, we must be very efficient," Georgia replied with a smile. "Not much space, many people. You learn to organize well or you go crazy." As winter approached in earnest, the first snow arrived in early November, transforming the landscape overnight into something that looked like the winter scenes from Georgia's childhood, except vaster and more overwhelming. The work shifted to caring for animals that needed to be brought closer to the barns, ensuring adequate hay stores, and keeping the house warm against temperatures that plunged far below freezing. Ben had worried about how Georgia would handle her first Montana winter, but she proved more resilient than he had expected. She had grown up with cold German winters, and while Montana's were more severe, the principle was the same: stay warm, stay busy, and endure. They spent long evenings close to the fire, Georgia often mending or knitting while Ben repaired tack or tools. Sometimes Ben would read aloud from the few books they owned, partially for Georgia's English practice and partially because they both enjoyed the stories. She particularly loved when he read from a volume of poetry, though she did not always understand every word. One particularly fierce night, with wind howling around the house and snow piling against the windows, Georgia sat close to Ben on the small sofa he had pulled near the fireplace. "Tell me truly," she said quietly. "Are you happy you sent for a bride? Are you happy it was me who came? Ben set aside the harness he had been oiling and turned to face her fully. "Georgia, I am happier than I have been since before my parents died. This house felt empty before you came. Now it feels like a home. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. Even though I burned the biscuits last week. Even though you burned the biscuits," he smiled. "Even though you still sometimes mix up English words in ways that make no sense. Even though you snore a little when you are very tired." "I do not snore," Georgia protested, laughing. "You do, but it is adorable." Ben pulled her closer. "I would not change a single thing about you." Georgia nestled against him, watching the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Sometimes I think about that day I arrived, how scared I was, how strange everything seemed, how I could barely speak to you. You are doing much better now. Your English is excellent, because you are good teacher, and patient." She tilted her head to look up at him. "I think we are lucky, Ben. Many mail-order marriages are not happy. People stay together because they must, not because they want to, but we are truly partners." "We are," Ben agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And I plan to make sure we stay that way. I promise I will never take you for granted, Georgia. I will work every day to make you happy." "Then I promise the same," Georgia said. "We will make each other happy." Christmas that year was a quiet affair, just the two of them and Pepper. But Georgia made it special with decorations crafted from pine boughs and berries, and traditional German cookies that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon and clove. Ben surprised her with a new wool shawl he had purchased during a trip to town, dyed a deep blue that matched her eyes. "It is beautiful," Georgia breathed, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Thank you, Ben." "There is something else," Ben said, looking oddly nervous. He produced a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring with a small chip of a diamond. "I know I did not give you a proper ring when we married. I wanted to, but I did not have the money then. I have been saving, and I wanted you to have this." Georgia's eyes filled with tears as Ben slipped the ring onto her finger beside the simple band from their wedding. "It is perfect. Ben, you did not have to." "I wanted to," he interrupted. "I want everyone to know you are my wife, and I want you to have something beautiful that shows how much I love you." Georgia threw her arms around his neck, kissing him with all the love and gratitude welling up in her heart. They spent Christmas Day in warm companionship, Georgia teaching Ben to make some of her family's traditional recipes, and Ben teaching Georgia a card game his father had taught him years ago. As the new year of 1877 approached, Georgia realized she had been in Montana for 6 months. Half a year ago, she had been a frightened girl stepping off a stagecoach into an alien world. Now she was a woman who could manage a household, help run a ranch, communicate effectively in a second language, and who was deeply in love with her husband. Winter gradually loosened its grip as February gave way to March. The snow began to melt, revealing the brown grass beneath, and the days grew incrementally longer. Ben began preparing for spring work, and Georgia found herself eager to start her garden again, this time with the knowledge of what had worked and failed the previous year. One morning in early April, Georgia woke feeling nauseated. She barely made it outside before losing the contents of her stomach, and when she returned to the house, she found Ben watching her with concerned eyes. "Are you ill? Should I ride for the doctor?" "No," Georgia said slowly, realization dawning. "I do not think I am ill. I think I might be with child." Ben's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, hope, and finally pure joy. "Truly, you think you are carrying our baby? I am not certain yet, but the signs." Georgia placed a hand over her still flat stomach. "I think yes." Ben whooped with delight, picking Georgia up and spinning her around before setting her down carefully, as though she might break. "A baby. We are going to have a baby." Over the next weeks, as other symptoms confirmed George's suspicion, they began planning for their growing family. Ben started work on a cradle during the evenings, carefully sanding each piece of wood until it was smooth as silk. Georgia began sewing tiny clothes, her heart swelling with love for the child she had not yet met. The pregnancy progressed well through spring and into summer. Georgia continued her normal work as long as she was able, though Ben hovered anxiously whenever she lifted anything heavier than a dishcloth. In August, Ben insisted on taking her to town to see the doctor, a stern-faced man named Dr. Morrison, who examined Georgia and pronounced her and the baby healthy. "Baby should come sometime in late December or early January," Dr. Morrison informed them. "Mrs. Parker is strong and healthy. I see no reason to expect complications, but send word when her time comes, and I will drive out if the weather permits." As they drove back to the ranch, Georgia's hand rested on her rounded belly, feeling the frequent kicks and movements of the active baby within. "I hope the baby will be healthy," she said softly, "and that I will be good mother." "You will be an excellent mother," Ben assured her, "and our baby will be healthy and strong just like you." Autumn passed in a blur of preparation. Ben chopped extra firewood, determined that Georgia and the baby would never be cold. He also made sure their food stores were more than adequate, hunting deer and preserving the meat, ensuring they had enough supplies to last through winter even if they were snowed in for weeks. Georgia nested with the determination of a woman preparing for battle, washing and rewashing the baby clothes, organizing the small room they had designated as the nursery, and trying to mentally prepare herself for the reality of bringing a child into the world. In mid-December, the first contractions began. They started as a mild discomfort that Georgia initially dismissed as the normal aches of late pregnancy, but as the day progressed, they increased in intensity and frequency. By evening, there was no doubt that the baby was coming. Ben immediately wanted to ride for the doctor, but a snowstorm had blown in that afternoon, making the journey dangerous. Georgia, remembering her mother's stories of childbirth, tried to remain calm. "Many babies are born without doctors," she told Ben, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Women have been doing this for thousands of years. We will manage." "But I do not know what to do," Ben said, his voice tight with panic. "What if something goes wrong?" "Then we will figure it out together," Georgia said firmly, though a fresh contraction made her gasp and grip the back of a chair. The labor progressed through the night, and Ben proved to be more help than either of them had expected. He boiled water, brought clean linens, and held Georgia's hand through the contractions, talking to her in a mixture of English and his clumsy German, trying to distract her from the pain. As dawn broke on December 18th, 1877, their son entered the world with a healthy wail that seemed to shake the rafters. Ben, who had been terrified throughout the entire ordeal, found himself laughing and crying simultaneously as he carefully wrapped the baby in a soft blanket and placed him in Georgia's arms. "A boy," Georgia breathed, exhausted but radiant. "Ben, we have a son." "He is perfect," Ben whispered, staring in wonder at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. "Absolutely perfect." They named him William Henry Parker, William after Ben's father and Henry after George's father. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he finally opened his eyes days later, they were a deep blue that reminded Georgia of the Montana sky. The first weeks of parenthood were challenging. William proved to be a healthy baby but a demanding one, waking frequently throughout the night and requiring constant attention. Georgia, still recovering from childbirth, pushed herself to meet his needs while trying to maintain the household. Ben helped as much as he could between his ranch duties, walking the floor with a crying William at night and watching him so Georgia could sleep during the day. "I do not know how my mother did this 7 times," Georgia said one particularly exhausting evening, as William finally settled into sleep after an hour of fussing. "She probably wondered the same thing," Ben replied, gently tucking the blanket around their son. "But look at him, Georgia. He is worth every sleepless night," Georgia had to agree. Despite the exhaustion, despite the challenges, William was the most precious thing she had ever seen. As winter released its grip and spring arrived once more, life settled into a new rhythm. William grew quickly, becoming more alert and responsive. His first smile, appearing when he was about 6 weeks old, made both his parents dissolve into foolish grins. His first laugh, a delightful gurgle that erupted when Ben was tickling his feet, became their favorite sound in the world. Georgia's English was now completely fluent, though she still spoke German to William, wanting him to know both languages. Ben had continued his German studies, and the household often rang with a mixture of both languages, sometimes in the same conversation. One afternoon in May, as they sat on the porch watching William kick and coo on a blanket spread in the shade, Ben reached over and took George's hand. "You remember 2 years ago when you arrived in paradise?" he asked. "You looked so scared and so brave at the same time." "I was terrified," Georgia admitted. "Everything was strange. I could not understand anything anyone said. I wondered if I had made terrible mistake." And now, Georgia looked at her husband, at their son, at the ranch that had become her home. "Now I know I made the best decision of my life. Coming here, marrying you, building this life, it is everything I did not know I wanted." "I am glad," Ben said softly, "because I cannot imagine my life without you anymore. You and William, you are everything to me." They sat in comfortable silence, the Montana breeze carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers, the future stretching before them full of promise and possibility. As the years passed, their family grew. In 1879, they welcomed a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, after Ben's sister and George's mother. Sarah had her mother's dark hair and her father's sky-blue eyes, and she was a calmer baby than William had been, much to George's relief. William proved to be a bright, energetic child who followed his father everywhere, already dreaming of being a cowboy like Papa. He learned both English and German with ease, switching between them without thought. Sarah, when she began to talk, did the same, though she showed more interest in her mother's kitchen and garden than in ranch work. In 1881, another son arrived, whom they named Thomas Georg, Georg being the German form of George to honor George's family. Thomas was quieter than William but more mischievous than Sarah, keeping his parents constantly alert to his adventures. The ranch prospered along with their family. Ben's careful management and hard work, combined with George's practical wisdom and organizational skills, allowed them to expand their herd and improve their property. They built the larger barn Ben had dreamed of and added rooms to the house to accommodate their growing family. Georgia's garden became famous in Paradise, and she often sold or traded her excess produce to townspeople. She also became known for her baking, her German recipes becoming favorites at church socials and town gatherings. Despite being an immigrant, she had been welcomed into the community, her warmth and kindness winning over even those who might have been skeptical of foreigners. Ben served on the local Cattlemen's Association and became a respected voice in community matters. The shy, awkward cowboy who had stood nervously waiting for his mail-order bride had grown into a confident man, secure in himself and his place in the world. On a warm evening in June of 1885, Nearly 9 years after George's arrival in paradise, the family gathered on the expanded porch after supper. William, now almost 8, was teaching Thomas to whittle under his father's supervision. Sarah was helping her mother shell peas, chattering happily about a bird's nest she had found in the barn. Georgia paused in her work, looking around at her family, at the ranch spreading out before them, at the mountains rising in the distance. Sometimes it still amazed her how her life had turned out. She thought of herself at 19, frightened and determined, stepping off that stagecoach into an unknown future. "What are you thinking about?" Ben asked, noticing her reflective expression. "I am thinking about how far we have come," Georgia replied. "From that first day when we could barely understand each other to now, to all of this." She gestured to encompass their children, their home, their life together. "You ever regret it, leaving Germany, coming here?" It was a question Ben still asked occasionally, as though he needed reassurance that she was truly happy. Georgia smiled, reaching over to take his hand. "Never," she said firmly. "Not once. This is my home. You are my home. I would cross 1,000 oceans to get here again if I had to." Ben raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I love you, Georgia Parker, more than I did yesterday, less than I will tomorrow." "Where did you learn such poetry?" Georgia teased, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "From you," Ben replied simply. "You taught me to say what is in my heart." As the sun set over Montana, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Parker family remained on the porch, together in the quiet comfort of an ordinary evening that was, in its own way, extraordinary. They had built something solid and true, a marriage founded on respect and patience, deepened by love and commitment, and blessed with children who would carry both their languages and their values forward into the future. In the years that followed, there would be challenges, as there always are in any life. Harsh winters and summer droughts would test the ranch. Illnesses would worry them, though mercifully none proved fatal. The children would grow and sometimes frustrate their parents with typical childhood rebellions. But through it all, Ben and Georgia would face everything as they had learned to face life from the very beginning, together. William would eventually take over the ranch, marrying a teacher from paradise and raising his own children on the land his grandfather had homesteaded. Sarah would surprise everyone by becoming a doctor, one of the first women in Montana to do so, inspired by Dr. Morrison's care during her brother's various childhood injuries. Thomas would become a veterinarian, combining his love of animals with a desire to help ranching families like his own. But those stories were still years in the future. On this June evening in 1885, they were simply a family, complete and content, living proof that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the bravest leaps of faith. Georgia had crossed an ocean speaking broken English, her future uncertain, her heart full of hope and fear in equal measure. Ben had opened his home and his heart to a stranger, willing to be patient, willing to learn, willing to let love grow at its own pace. Together, they had learned each other's languages, but more importantly, they had learned each other's hearts. They had built a life that honored both their backgrounds, that celebrated both their cultures, that created something new and beautiful from the combination of old world and new. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ben pulled Georgia close against his side, their children's voices a gentle background melody to the evening. This was home. This was happiness. This was the life they had built word by word, day by day, from that first stumbling conversation over a German-English dictionary to this moment of perfect understanding. And if sometimes Georgia still mixed up her English words, or Ben still struggled with German pronunciation, it did not matter. They had learned the most important language of all, The language of love, which needed no dictionary to translate, no lessons to master, only two hearts willing to be patient, willing to listen, and willing to grow together. The story of the mail-order bride who arrived speaking broken English and the cowboy who learned her language and her heart had its happy ending. But it was not really an ending at all. It was simply the middle of a much longer story, one that would continue through children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all carrying forward the legacy of courage, patience, and love that began on a hot July day in Paradise, Montana Territory, in 1876.